They tell you that if someone really cares, they'll come back. They tell you that silence means indifference, that distance means they've moved on, that the lack of a message is your answer. But when it comes to avoidant dynamics, that belief quietly keeps you stuck, doubting yourself, waiting for something that feels unfinished. Because what looks like confidence on the outside is often fear underneath. What looks like pride is often panic, and what looks like they don't care enough to reach out is very often they're terrified you'll reject them if they do. This isn't about you not being enough. It's about them being emotionally overwhelmed by the possibility that the power has shifted and they might not survive that moment intact. Avoidants don't avoid because they feel nothing. They avoid because they feel too much at once and don't know how to regulate it. The moment you pull back, the moment you stop chasing, the moment your energy changes, something inside them starts to fracture. But instead of reaching out, instead of hoovering, instead of risking that one vulnerable move, they freeze. And that freeze is not peace. It's internal chaos. It's the collision of desire and fear, attachment and self-protection, longing and shame. They want reassurance, but they cannot tolerate the possibility of hearing no. So they choose silence because silence at least protects the illusion that they're still in control. What most people misunderstand about hovering is that it isn't just about wanting you back. Hovering requires emotional risk. It requires exposure. It requires stepping forward without certainty. And for an avoidant, that moment feels like standing emotionally naked in front of someone who now holds power. They no longer trust themselves to manage. Reaching out means admitting you mattered. It means admitting the connection affected them. It means accepting that you might not respond the way you once did. And that possibility alone is enough to keep them frozen. On the surface, avoidants appear self-sufficient. They tell themselves they don't need anyone, that they're fine alone, that relationships are optional. But deep down, rejection hits them differently than abandonment. Abandonment confirms what they already believe, that closeness is unsafe and temporary. Rejection, however, threatens their identity. Rejection says, "You wanted me, and I chose not to choose you." That feels unbearable. It activates shame, not sadness. It doesn't just hurt, it destabilizes how they see themselves. So they avoid the situation entirely, even if it costs them the connection. When you go quiet, when you stop explaining, when you stop proving, something shifts inside them. Your absence isn't just noticed, it's felt as judgment. They don't interpret your silence as neutral. They interpret it as evaluation. They imagine you seeing clearly now, seeing through the patterns, seeing what you once tolerated and no longer will. And that imagined version of you becomes terrifying. Because now, reaching out doesn't feel like reconnecting. It feels like submitting to a verdict. This is where people get confused. They think, if they were scared of losing me, they'd reach out. But avoidants don't move toward fear. They retreat from it. They wait. They watch. They replay old conversations in their head, searching for clues that the door is still open. They check signs indirectly. They look for confirmation without exposure. Because as long as they don't try, they can tell themselves they weren't rejected. They just chose not to engage. That distinction matters deeply to them. Hoovering for an avoidant only feels safe when they believe the outcome is guaranteed. When they sense availability, softness, predictability. But the moment you reclaim your emotional center, the moment you detach without hostility, the moment you stop reacting the way you used to, the rules change. Now they can't read you. Now they don't know if they'd be welcomed or turned away. And that uncertainty feels like standing at the edge of a cliff without knowing how deep the fall is. This is why they often wait for you to break no contact. Not because they don't care, but because if you reach out first, it restores the hierarchy they need to feel safe. It tells them they're still wanted, still desired, still in control of the pace. It removes the risk of rejection. It allows them to engage without vulnerability. And when that doesn't happen, when you stay grounded, calm, emotionally unavailable to chaos, they don't feel empowered. They feel exposed. Avoidants confuse power with safety. They learned early that needing someone was dangerous, that depending meant getting hurt, that closeness came with strings they couldn't control. So they built an identity around emotional independence. But the moment someone walks away without drama, without begging, without anger, that identity starts to crack. Because now independence doesn't feel strong, it feels lonely, and control doesn't feel protective. It feels empty. Inside their silence is not confidence, it's self-negotiation. They tell themselves stories to justify not reaching out. If they wanted me, they'd come back. If I mattered, they'd say something. It's better this way, but underneath those stories is fear. Fear of hearing nothing back. Fear of being seen trying. Fear of realizing they waited too long. Fear of discovering that the version of you who once tolerated inconsistency no longer exists. And here's the part that hits hardest for them. Your emotional detachment isn't read as weakness, it's read as growth. They sense it intuitively. They feel the shift in your energy. You're no longer reaching, no longer proving, no longer centering your worth around their response. And that growth highlights their stagnation. It shows them what they avoided facing in themselves, and that awareness doesn't motivate them. It paralyzes them. They don't hoover because hoovering requires humility. It requires admitting, I might want you more than you want me right now, and that imbalance feels intolerable. So instead, they observe from a distance. They lurk, they check, they wonder. Watching feels safer than acting. Because watching keeps hope alive without risking humiliation. Watching allows them to stay emotionally invested while pretending they're not. What you need to understand is that their fear of rejection is not a reflection of your value. It's a reflection of their inability to tolerate emotional exposure. Your silence didn't push them away. It removed their safety net. It forced them to confront a reality where they no longer dictate the terms, and for someone whose entire attachment system is built around control, that realization is terrifying. This is why, paradoxically, the stronger and calmer you become, the harder it is for them to reach out. Not because they don't care, but because they care too much and don't trust themselves to survive the answer. And in that fear, they choose the one thing that protects their ego. Even if it costs them the connection, they do nothing. And if you're sitting there wondering whether they'll ever come back, whether they'll ever realize what they lost, whether silence means the end, remember this. The moment you stopped chasing, the moment you stopped needing, the moment you reclaimed your emotional power, the dynamic changed permanently. Whether they reach out or not, no longer defines your worth. Their there no longer gets to dictate your future. And that, quietly, is the shift they feel most deeply, even if they never say a word. You've reclaimed your space, your calm, your independence, and suddenly the relationship that once felt familiar now feels like uncharted territory for them. The energy has shifted. You are no longer running on the scripts they wrote, the expectations they set, or the emotional games they perfected, and they notice this shift more than you realize. Every pause, every silence, every moment you no longer seek validation from them is a message louder than words could ever be. It communicates something they are terrified of confronting. You are no longer theirs to influence, and the certainty that once defined them is gone. Inside, they panic in a way that doesn't show. They replay memories, every laugh, every conversation, every shared glance, trying to find cracks in your newfound composure. They ask themselves silently if they misjudged you, if you've grown past them, if the person they once had access to is now someone entirely different. This isn't about love, at least not in the way most people experience it. It's about control, fear, and the realization that the emotional patterns they relied on can no longer be guaranteed. You are no longer predictable, and unpredictability terrifies them more than any confrontation ever could. They want the old dynamic back, because the old dynamic was safe, not for you, but for them. They want the version of you who tolerated inconsistency, who adjusted, who provided validation without question, who made it easy to remain distant and aloof while still feeling needed. That version is gone, replaced by someone who commands their own value, who doesn't bend to the emotional gravity they once controlled. And that makes them feel naked. Their pride, their carefully constructed armor, is at risk of exposure, and they are not ready to face that vulnerability. Avoidants do not handle emotional risk well, and reaching out is the ultimate emotional risk. To Hoover, they would have to admit a need, a desire, an attachment that could be rejected. They would have to step forward without certainty, without guarantee that the outcome will protect their ego. And every instinct inside them screams against that vulnerability. So instead, they do nothing. They wait. They watch. They imagine scenarios where you initiate the contact, scenarios where you might make the first move. They invest in hope without ever exposing themselves, because hope is safe, risk is not. The most painful truth for them is that your absence forces self-reflection. They cannot hide behind the narrative that you are still chasing, still proving, still emotionally available. Your calm independence mirrors the distance they always feared, yet never experienced in reverse. Suddenly, the one person they imagine they could always rely on is standing firmly on their own, unshaken by their inaction. That is a reflection they cannot avoid. It is a truth they cannot rewrite. And that truth terrifies them more than any rejection ever could, because it reminds them of what they might lose forever. This is where overthinking takes over. They replay conversations repeatedly, trying to detect signs of warmth, looking for moments where they could have misread you, trying to anticipate your reactions. They calculate, hesitate, and freeze, trapped between desire and fear. Every potential move is weighed against the catastrophic possibility of failure. And in that calculation, in that endless mental loop, they do not reach out. They wait for certainty that may never come, because the fear of rejection is too consuming to risk. Your absence also shines a light on what they avoided feeling all along. The vulnerability they suppressed, the dependency they denied, the emotions they tried to control. It all surfaces when you stop providing the constant feedback loop they relied on. You didn't push them. You simply reclaimed your energy, and that reclamation exposes the cracks they have spent years hiding from themselves. The truth is undeniable. You are thriving without them, and they cannot tolerate witnessing it without feeling their own inadequacy. Every time you remain composed, detached, grounded, you communicate a message that cannot be ignored. Your value is independent of their presence. Their hesitation is not a reflection of you failing. It is a reflection of their inability to navigate a reality where they no longer have influence. They see strength in you, stability in you, and that stability feels like a mirror showing them their own fear and insecurity. They cannot approach you without facing that internal dissonance, and so the silence continues, a heavy, invisible tension that is both terrifying and humbling for them. They watch from a distance, analyzing without acting, because observation feels safer than exposure. Every social media post, every story, every subtle interaction becomes a puzzle, a test, a measure of whether they have lost too much control. They crave confirmation, but they want it without risk, and in this paradox, their emotional paralysis deepens. They desire connection, but they cannot risk rejection. They long for you, but they cannot risk revealing that longing. They are trapped in their own mind, haunted by the possibility of what might be, paralyzed by the very reality that you have created through calm detachment. And it's not just fear. They are deeply aware of change. They sense growth, not just in you, but in how they relate to you. They sense a shift in power dynamics, a recalibration of boundaries, an undeniable movement towards self-sufficiency that cannot be ignored. That awareness shakes them, not because they do not care, but because they do care too much, and fear they cannot navigate the new terms. Every instinct they once trusted now feels uncertain, and that uncertainty magnifies the risk of emotional exposure beyond what they feel capable of handling. This is why hoovering does not happen immediately, if at all. It requires courage. They have not cultivated an emotional resilience they have avoided building. Reaching out would mean confronting the very parts of themselves they spent a lifetime protecting. It would mean admitting need, acknowledging attachment, and accepting the possibility of failure. And until they feel some guarantee, some safety net, that they will not be rejected, the act of hoovering feels like stepping into a storm with no shelter. The risk outweighs the desire, and they retreat further into observation and internal negotiation. When they do not reach out, it is not because the connection is meaningless. It is because they are terrified of the consequences of trying. The avoidance is a reflection of fear, not absence of feeling. And every day that passes without them initiating contact reinforces the lesson they hope to avoid. Emotional exposure is dangerous, and control is fleeting. Your independence is a silent authority that commands respect, whether they consciously acknowledge it or not. And that authority is what makes the possibility of rejection so frightening. It is no longer theoretical. It is a mirror of their own vulnerability. This is why your consistency, your calm, and your presence in absence is so powerful. It is not about manipulation or punishment. It is about living in a way that communicates your value without negotiation. It is about showing them that your emotional reality does not depend on their actions, and that is the ultimate paradox. The more you detach with love and integrity, the more they feel the pull, the more they sense the risk of loss, and the more they hesitate to act because they fear they cannot handle the answer they might receive. In the quiet moments, in the absence of communication, you are teaching them lessons they cannot articulate. You are demonstrating that emotional availability is not a weapon to be wielded, but a choice that has consequences. You are showing that growth, self-respect, and boundaries are not punishments. They are standards. And in witnessing these qualities, they are forced to confront the reality that the connection they once assumed they controlled is now operating on terms they cannot dictate. That confrontation, unseen and unspoken, is more terrifying to them than any direct rejection could ever be. They want certainty, but you provide clarity. They want control, but you have autonomy. They fear rejection, but you are no longer reacting to their fear. And in this tension, they are suspended, caught between desire and avoidance, between longing and terror, between the past they thought they owned and the present they cannot influence. Every decision they fail to make is a testament to the inner conflict you have triggered, whether intentionally or not. And that conflict is exactly why they hesitate, why they watch, and why they do not hoover, even if part of them desperately wants to. The depth of their fear is often hidden beneath calm, aloof exterior. It is the silent quake beneath the surface of their composed demeanor. They measure every potential step, every possible message, every imagined response, calculating outcomes, avoiding emotional risk at all costs. They are caught in a paradox. The more they care, the more they fear exposure. The more they fear exposure, the more they hesitate. The more they hesitate, the more they risk losing the connection entirely. And in that loop, you exist not as a threat, but as a reflection of what they cannot safely face. Your presence in absence transforms the dynamic. It shifts the power, silently, without confrontation. It demonstrates resilience, self-worth, and independence in ways that words cannot. And that transformation is what triggers the core of their fear. The fear that they are no longer central, that their influence is diminished, that the certainty they once relied upon is gone. They do not hoover, because hoovering requires emotional honesty, risk, and courage, all of which collide with the internal narrative they have maintained for years. And so they wait, watching, overthinking, fearing, and yearning, all while remaining frozen in the paradox you have created simply by existing fully in your own power. What they don't realize is that their hesitation, their careful calculations, their distance, it speaks louder than words ever could. Every pause, every delayed thought, every moment of observation becomes a reflection of their fear, and that reflection is what you sense even when you try not to. You may think they've detached because they don't care, but in reality they care too much, and in a way that terrifies them. Their emotions are like fire. They cannot safely contain, and the more you step into your own stability, the hotter that fire burns without an outlet. They watch. They wonder, they imagine, but they do not act because the risk of emotional devastation is simply too high. They fear your growth more than your absence. That's a truth most people never consider. They can handle distance, they can handle silence, they can even endure separation. But growth is different. Growth changes the rules, it challenges their identity, it shifts the landscape of the connection. When you evolve, when you reclaim your emotional power, when you no longer bend to patterns they relied on, it forces them to face a reality they've always avoided. They are no longer the safe center of your world. That awareness terrifies them because it threatens everything they built to feel secure. They replay scenarios endlessly, imagining ways to regain proximity without risking too much. They test the boundaries silently, waiting for a slip, for a signal, for an opening that feels safe. And each time you maintain your calm, each time you stay grounded, each time you choose your own worth over reacting to their presence or absence, it reinforces the distance that frightens them. You are no longer a puzzle they can manipulate, a game they can control, or a certainty they can depend upon. You are a reality they must reckon with, and reckoning is never easy. Avoidants measure risk constantly. To hoover is not just to reach out, it is to expose themselves emotionally, to risk rejection, to admit that they wanted what they cannot guarantee. That risk triggers their deepest fears, vulnerability, inadequacy, shame, and until they can reconcile those fears, they remain frozen. They do not move toward you because every potential step feels like stepping into a storm they cannot predict. Watching feels safer. Waiting feels safer. Imagining feels safer because it allows them to feel connection without risking their self-image. That safety, paradoxically, is what keeps them distant. What is often invisible to you, yet palpable in effect, is that your consistent presence in absence becomes a mirror. It reflects what they cannot face within themselves. It demonstrates stability, self-respect, and emotional integrity in a way that cannot be argued with. They sense it, they feel it. Every moment of your calm is a message louder than any attempt they could make to hoover. That message is simple. You no longer revolve around their choices. Your worth is independent of their actions. And that independence is intimidating because it threatens the very structures they relied on to feel safe. They long to reach out because desire still exists. They are drawn to what they lost, but that desire is shackled by fear. Every imagined message, every potential approach is weighed against the possibility of rejection and the emotional collapse that could follow. And because avoidance is a defense mechanism, they retreat further rather than risk exposure. They cling to observation because observation is neutral, safe, and controllable. Action, however, demands vulnerability, and vulnerability is the very thing they avoid at all costs. That is why they don't hoover. It is never a lack of feeling, it is a fear of feeling too deeply. The silence you encounter is layered. It is not emptiness, it is filled with calculation, longing, anxiety, and self-protection. They scan your life for signs, for openings, for reassurance, without ever daring to reach out. Each post you share, each story, each subtle indication of growth or stability becomes a reference point, a test they cannot pass without risking exposure. And each passing day where they do not act is a testament not to their indifference, but to the intensity of their fear. Their emotional paralysis is a shadow of what they wish they could feel safely without consequence. Your detachment forces them to confront what they have avoided for so long. The self-reflection that arises is uncomfortable because it cannot be ignored. They cannot pretend the connection is unchanged. They cannot fabricate control when you no longer react. They see your calm as strength, and in contrast, recognize their own instability. That recognition is terrifying because it is unflinching. It does not lie. It does not excuse. It does not negotiate. You have become the embodiment of what they cannot safely approach, and that embodiment holds more power than any confrontation ever could. Every instinct they have built around maintaining control, avoiding risk, and protecting themselves is now challenged. The presence of your independence, your self-worth, your calm, and your lack of need is an invisible force field that both attracts and repels. They feel drawn to you because desire persists, because connection once mattered, because intimacy was not entirely lost. But they cannot cross that threshold without risking the self-concept they have relied on for years. That internal conflict is what makes them hesitate, overthink, and ultimately remain distant. Your choice to remain grounded in yourself, even in absence, forces the ultimate confrontation they never wanted. The realization that they no longer control the emotional narrative. You are no longer reacting to them, chasing them, negotiating your worth around their availability. That shift terrifies them because it destabilizes the emotional patterns they have depended upon. They see what they lost, they feel what they cannot safely regain, and the fear of rejection, of being confronted with the truth of their own inadequacy, prevents them from initiating. Hoovering, in essence, would require courage. They have not cultivated, vulnerability they have avoided, and honesty they cannot yet face. They long for certainty, because certainty protects their ego. They want you to reach out first, because it guarantees safety. It guarantees validation. It guarantees that their exposure will not lead to rejection. But you no longer provide that guarantee. And suddenly, every step forward feels like a risk. They analyze, they hesitate, they overthink, and each moment reinforces the very distance they wish to close. Your calm presence in absence becomes both a beacon and a barrier, showing them what is possible yet reminding them of the cost they are unwilling to pay. What is most powerful and painful for them is that your growth, your independence, and your calm are not punishments. You are not trying to manipulate, control, or punish. You are simply living fully in your own power. And that authenticity, that refusal to compromise your emotional reality, exposes the gap between what they wish they could do and what they are capable of doing. Every moment they hesitate is a reflection of their fear, and every moment you maintain your composure is a silent assertion of your worth, unshaken by their inaction. The paradox is clear. The more they care, the more they hesitate. The more they hesitate, the more they risk losing. The more they risk losing, the more immobilized they feel. Desire collides with fear, longing collides with avoidance, and every potential action becomes a calculation of risk rather than an expression of connection. Watching from a distance becomes the compromise that allows them to feel involved without confronting vulnerability. And in this tension, your quiet strength becomes the ultimate measure of power, a power they fear, even if they secretly admire it. They are aware of your presence in absence more than you realize. Every choice you make, every moment of self-respect, every act of calm detachment sends signals they cannot ignore. They sense growth, autonomy, and boundaries that do not bend to them. That awareness terrifies them because it illuminates everything they have avoided, confronting their own fear of rejection, their own vulnerability, their own inability to tolerate risk. Your existence in this state is a mirror, silent and unwavering, reflecting the very truths they are desperate to avoid. And so, they wait, they watch, they calculate, they overthink, they imagine reaching out, yet they cannot act. The fear of rejection, the fear of exposure, the fear of being seen as needing something they cannot control, keeps them frozen, and every day that passes, the lesson is reinforced. Emotional honesty and vulnerability are not yet safe territories for them to explore. And through all of this, you remain steady, independent, and unshakable, embodying the very power that prevents them from risking the connection they secretly crave. In essence, their silence is a paradox of care and fear. It is not indifference, it is a reflection of their internal struggle. They are drawn to you because the connection matters, yet they are repelled because the stakes are too high. Every hesitation, every watchful moment, every mental replay of past interactions is an expression of longing entwined with terror. And the more you maintain your boundaries, your self-worth and your calm, the more that paradox intensifies, holding them suspended in a limbo between what they desire and what they fear. The moment you fully step into your own power, something shifts that they can feel but cannot name. They realize that the version of you who waited, who begged, who negotiated your worth around their attention, no longer exists. That person has been replaced by someone whose value is undeniable and independent, someone who does not bend, compromise, or justify their presence. And this realization terrifies them more than any confrontation ever could, because it forces them to acknowledge a truth they have avoided their entire life. Control is an illusion, and their influence over you is no longer guaranteed. You no longer orbit around their need for certainty. You have created your own gravity, and that shift unsettles them to their core. Avoidants fear rejection more than they fear distance. They will tolerate separation, maintain walls, and hide behind aloofness to protect themselves. But rejection is different. Rejection is personal, exposing and final. It says in no uncertain terms that the choice they hoped to control was denied, and the mere thought of you saying no, whether explicitly or implicitly through your calm independence, is enough to paralyze them. It is not a lack of care that keeps them silent. It is the fear that reaching out could backfire in a way they cannot recover from emotionally. They replay every memory, every conversation, every laugh, and every argument in their mind, trying to determine whether you still care, whether you will respond, whether the dynamic can ever be restored. They imagine scenarios where they could reach out safely without risking humiliation or rejection, but those scenarios are fleeting and unstable because life does not guarantee certainty. And when they cannot find safety in action, they retreat further into observation, into mental rehearsals, into avoidance. Every imagined message, every potential approach is dissected, measured, and ultimately shelved because the possibility of rejection is simply too threatening. Your calm, independent presence becomes a mirror they cannot avoid. They sense the strength you have built, the boundaries you maintain, the emotional stability you carry, and it highlights the very areas where they have remained stagnant. They see the growth they have ignored, the self-worth they have avoided cultivating, and the resilience they have denied themselves. That mirror is uncomfortable, intimidating, and threatening to their ego. And yet, despite this fear, there is longing, there is desire, there is a part of them that wishes they could reach out, that wishes they could step into connection without risk. But that part remains silent, trapped behind walls of avoidance and fear. The paradox is suffocating for them. They want you, they miss you, they imagine the connection, but they cannot act. They fear emotional exposure, fear rejection, and fear facing the reality that you are no longer dependent on them for your sense of value. Watching becomes safer than doing. Observing becomes easier than risking. Waiting becomes their refuge because action threatens the delicate balance of control they have relied on for years. And in that waiting, they experience anxiety, longing, and regret without ever admitting it, because acknowledging it would require vulnerability they are not ready to face. Every time you remain consistent in your independence, every time you maintain your emotional stability, every time you refuse to bend to their fear or their manipulations, you reinforce a reality that terrifies them. You are no longer theirs to tour, and that realization is a crucible for them, testing their emotional resilience and exposing the fragility they have hidden from the world. Your quiet strength is more powerful than any confrontation because it forces them to confront truths they have spent a lifetime avoiding. They fear not just your absence, but the possibility that you have moved on entirely. That fear is amplified because it is tied to their need for control. They crave certainty, yet you no longer provide it on their terms. You have shifted the rules of engagement without saying a word, and that silence speaks volumes. They are aware of it, even if they cannot articulate it. They feel it in every glance they imagine, every post they analyze, every subtle sign of your emotional independence. And that feeling is terrifying because it confirms what they have suspected but never wanted to admit. They cannot predict your actions, and they cannot guarantee your attention. This is why hoovering does not come easily, and often does not come at all. Hoovering requires courage, vulnerability, and emotional honesty, all things that feel unsafe to them. It requires admitting they wanted something they cannot guarantee and risking a denial that could shatter their carefully constructed self-image. The internal risk outweighs the desire, and so they choose observation over action, analysis over vulnerability, and hesitation over exposure. And in that hesitation, the power dynamic shifts permanently. You are no longer reacting to them, but they are acutely aware of your presence and the stability you carry. Their longing and their fear exist simultaneously, creating a tension that can feel unbearable. They desire connection, yet the very act of pursuing it threatens their ego. They imagine the comfort of reaching out, yet they fear the emotional consequences of doing so. They want reassurance, yet the only way to receive it is to risk rejection. And until they can reconcile these opposing forces, they remain suspended, trapped between what they want and what they fear, paralyzed by the very dynamics that once defined the relationship. Even though they do not reach out, every action or inaction reveals the intensity of their internal struggle. Every mental calculation, every silent observation, every imagined scenario is a testament to the care they still feel, intertwined with the fear they cannot overcome. Their avoidance is not indifference, it is the manifestation of fear, self-protection, and uncertainty. And every day you remain grounded in your own worth. Every day you maintain your calm and your independence. You reinforce the very lesson they struggle to internalize. They no longer control your world, and their fear of rejection cannot dictate your reality. They sense your growth, your stability, and your unwavering self-respect, and those qualities which are empowering to you are intimidating to them. They recognize that reaching out would require exposing themselves in ways they are unprepared for, ways that feel dangerous to the self-image they have relied upon for years. And in that recognition lies their paralysis. They want connection, but they cannot risk the consequences. They want intimacy, but they cannot bear exposure. And they remain in that liminal space, suspended between desire and fear, longing and avoidance, attraction and terror. Your presence in absence becomes a force they cannot ignore. It does not manipulate, it does not coerce, it does not demand. They feel its weight because it communicates the truth. They cannot deny your worth is independent, your boundaries are intact, and your emotional power is undeniable. And that force unsettles them, terrifies them, and awakens in them an awareness of loss, longing, and limitation they have avoided their entire life. You are both a mirror and a measure, reflecting what they desire and revealing what they cannot safely confront. Every day that passes reinforces their dilemma. Observation replaces action, imagination replaces exposure, and hesitation replaces courage. And as you continue to exist fully in your own power, the tension intensifies. They are acutely aware of what they are missing, aware of the connection they once had, aware of the emotional honesty they avoided, yet they cannot bridge the gap without risking everything their avoidance has protected. And in this suspended state, they are trapped, longing for a reality they cannot safely create, while witnessing the undeniable truth of your independence. Your absence paradoxically becomes a presence they cannot escape. It shapes their internal world, confronts their defenses, and forces a reckoning they never anticipated. They may never articulate it, they may never act on it, but your quiet power exists as a force they feel with every thought, every imagined interaction, every fear of rejection. It is in that space that they are most aware of their limitations, most aware of your strength, and most aware of the connection they cannot safely attempt to restore. And that is the ultimate truth of why avoidants avoid hovering. It is not because they do not care, not because the connection does not matter, and not because they are indifferent. It is because the risk of rejection, the fear of exposure, and the challenge of vulnerability outweigh the desire to act. They are trapped between longing and fear, desire and avoidance, attraction and terror, and in that tension you exist as a force. They cannot fully approach but cannot ignore. Your calm, your independence, your self-respect. These are the very things that make them hesitate, that make them overthink, and that make them acutely aware of the connection they still secretly crave.